The first time they saw her stacking bricks in her cabin's hearth, the men near Jacob's Pass roared hard enough to send a few of them into coughing fits. It was late fall, just before the snow lines crept down from the peaks, and those who had settled the upper valley were all preoccupied with chopping, stacking, and sweating through firewood prep like they always did, axes ringing like bells across every homestead, cords stacked like fort walls. No one in their right mind would waste daylight on something as strange as bricking up their own fireplace. But there she was, a widow, maybe 30, with a narrow scar down her jawline and an Eastern way of speaking, laying bricks into the mouth of the stone hearth, as if sealing away some cursed room. They laughed. Oh, did they laugh? They said it was the most ridiculous thing they'd seen since old man Cordell tried to build a root cellar in the middle of a spring. Said she must be trying to cook herself like a meat pie. Or maybe her chimney had collapsed and she didn't know how to fix it. One even said he'd bet a whole silver dollar she'd be begging to borrow wood from his pile by the third hard frost. But Mary Haskell didn't explain a thing. She didn't even seem to care if they understood. The men came and went, dropping off occasional helpful warnings or offers to repair the chimney for her, always with that smirk, the one that lingered on a face longer than it had any right to, and always she just kept laying the bricks, tight, neat, intentional, until the once gaping maw of the fireplace was sealed up flat. No one knew what she used to heat her cabin after that, but she still chopped wood, only never as much as the others. And when the hard snows came and the wind began to screech through the pass like a banshee, something strange happened. Her chimney never smoked, and her cabin never froze. The first real freeze came early that year, early enough that the local creek froze straight across by the second week of November, cold enough that you could hear the frost snapping tree limbs overnight, cold enough that the wind stopped howling and started groaning. Folks wrapped their chimneys in sheet iron, doors swelled, frost gathered in corners, babies cried in the night from the chill, even when swaddled tight against their mother's breast, but not in Mary Haskell's cabin. One neighbor swore he passed by on a night so cold it turned whiskey to slush, and saw her window slightly open, as if it was spring. Another claimed he'd seen her barefoot inside, brushing her hair by lamplight. And the most damning detail of all, not a wisp of smoke from her chimney in over a week. No fire, no smoke, no sign of wood being burned. But she wasn't dead. She came to town every Friday, same as always, paid in coin, not trade, never begged, never borrowed, and she always looked warm. The gossip turned into something else, no longer laughter, but a subtle unease. Curiosity turned to discomfort, because while the rest of them were rationing wood, suffering split lips from the dry freeze, and praying the old mortar didn't crumble under the frostbite nights, she was living in a cabin with a bricked-up fireplace that stayed warm on less than a handful of wood. There was one man who couldn't let it go. Franklin Dobbs wasn't a cruel man, but he was proud. Built his cabin himself, cut every log with his own hands. He prided himself on knowing how to survive the high frontier better than most. And when his third stack of wood had already dwindled by December, and his own chimney was leaking cold air like a hole in a bucket, he snapped. "Maybe she found coal," he muttered one night over a jug of rye. "Coal?" One of the others scoffed. "She'd be hacking black soot up by now if she had coal. Maybe she's stewing with the devil," another laughed. That was when Dobbs stood up, jaw set. "I'm gonna find out." He waited for a mild day, such as they were. Snow up to the knees, but sunlight that carried no heat. He packed a pouch of jerky, a rope, and his flintlock. Not that he expected to use it, but old habits were hard to shake. He followed the creek bend toward Mary Haskell's cabin, crunching over snow crust, his boots sinking with every other step. And when he came around the ridge, he saw the strangest thing yet. No snow on her roof. All the other cabins had piles of snow so heavy they creaked under the weight. But hers, bone dry, as if the snow had melted away. The ground around the cabin steamed lightly, not much, but just enough for a man to stop and stare. She opened her door before he could knock. "Mr. Dobbs," she said plainly, not welcoming, not cold, just a flat acknowledgement, like someone naming a bird they'd seen before. "I thought I'd check in," he said. "Been a bitter stretch?" "I know," she said. Her cheeks weren't even red from cold. Her hair was tied back. Her sleeves were rolled. It was warm inside. He craned his neck. "Don't suppose I could take a look at what you did with that fireplace?" Mary didn't say yes. She didn't say no either. She stepped aside. What he saw inside that cabin stopped him cold. There was no fireplace, just a smooth, bricked-over wall where the hearth used to be. But beneath it, in the center of the room, a thick square of dark stone had been set into the floor, black and glistening like basalt, rimmed with mortar, unlike anything he'd seen before. Over it, a small iron pipe no wider than a stovepipe elbowed into the floor and curved toward the far wall. The room was warm, not just tolerable, warm enough to feel like spring, no smoke, no smell. just steady heat rising from the rock. "What in the hell is this?" he whispered. Mary walked past him, picked up a small bundle of twigs, not logs, not kindling. Twigs no bigger than matchsticks. She dropped them into a small iron box mounted beside the pipe, turned a tiny lever, and then, a soft hiss, a low thrum, the stone began to glow faintly, not red like a fire, but like embers beneath dark glass. The warmth intensified, and Dobbs actually stepped back from the sheer presence of it. "It's not magic," Mary said quietly. "It's design." The truth came slowly. Like most things out here, Mary had grown up the daughter of a brickmaker back east. Her brother had studied under an engineer, one who worked on kilns and furnaces in textile mills. One winter, when their father fell ill and wood ran out, and the brother had sealed up the fireplace and built a radiant floor hearth, bricked and insulated so well it held heat for 3 days on a small fire. She had remembered every detail. She had built it beneath her cabin with help from no one, layer after layer of dense brick and clay, then a cast iron box stove with stone beneath and above to capture and store the heat. She bricked the old fireplace not because she didn't need warmth, but because the old design wasted it. All the heat ran up the chimney. Hers stayed in the room. "You ever tried to heat soup in a pot with no lid?" she asked Dobbs. "That's what a chimney is." He didn't say a word, didn't laugh, didn't argue. He walked out of her cabin without a word and didn't speak of it again for weeks. But others began to notice. As the freeze dragged into January, with temperatures hitting -20, -25, one neighbor's chimney collapsed outright. Another's baby nearly died of cold before sunrise. Yet Mary's cabin still let out curls of gentle warmth when she opened her door to toss out water. And by then, others had begun asking, "How's she doing it?" They whispered. Some claimed witchcraft again. But Dobbs, who had mocked her loudest, now said nothing. Until one day, when the doctor's wood ran out, and his wife had taken to sleeping with a rifle under the blanket for warmth. He went to Mary's cabin with frostbitten hands and eyes full of something like shame. She let him in, and this time, she taught. Word spread slower than you'd think. The men around Jacob's Pass weren't the type to go confessing they'd learned something from a woman, much less a widow. Much less one from back east who spoke like she'd been to school. But frostbite makes the truth easier to swallow, especially when your own chimney's leaking smoke like a stabbed pig and the wind's rattling your stovepipe like it's trying to pry inside. By the second week of January, 3 cabins in the valley were sealed off entirely. Firewood was gone, the wind had turned deadlier, and men were beginning to say it outright. "If this keeps on, someone's gonna freeze before the thaw." That was when they stopped laughing altogether. They started walking up to Mary Haskell's cabin like penitents. Slow, quiet, humbled. Men who'd once rolled their eyes at her bricks now asked if she'd mind showing them a thing or two. One even brought his boy along, just to hear how she'd done it. She didn't gloat, she didn't smile, she simply let them in. It wasn't that her design was complicated, it was that no one had ever thought of doing it here. Mary's radiant hearth used thermal mass, bricks and stone that held heat like a reservoir. Instead of a roaring fire that blasted hot and lost most of it up a flue, she used a low, slow burn. A small iron chamber beneath the floor drew in air, warmed the thick slab above, and radiated it gently over hours. It had taken her weeks to build, layers of clay, sand, and brickwork. She'd sourced the iron box from a broken rail spur 2 towns over, and had wheeled it back in a cart with one axle and a wooden wheel she'd carved herself. She hadn't told anyone, because she knew what they'd say. Now, as the men stood in her home, caps clutched to their chests like schoolboys, she showed them how the lever worked, how you stacked only the driest twigs, how you closed the intake so the warmth soaked into the stone instead of fleeing. She even had diagrams, drawings she'd made herself with soot-black fingers and stiff joints in the dead of night when the wind screamed outside like it wanted her soul. "Why not tell us this before?" one asked, quiet. Mary didn't look up. "I did," she said, "when I laid the first brick. The hardest lesson came next. Humility." Franklin Dobbs, once proudest among them, was the first to ask her to help retrofit his cabin. His fingers were still healing from frostbite, and his wife had taken to sleeping with their children in one bed, tucked under every blanket they had. He offered her money, which she refused, and then offered help building something new in return. That she accepted. They tore out his hearth by hand, brick by crumbling brick, exposing the ash-caked ruin behind. He watched her mix mortar from clay and ash and crushed stone, saw her hammer steel sleeves into place, and marveled at the way she used almost no wood at all, just a handful per day. "It's a waste," she said, motioning to the stack of logs he'd split in 4. "You're burning 10 times what you need. You're not heating your home, you're heating the sky." "Never thought of it like that." "No one did," she said. "That's the trouble." The rest followed, one cabin at a time. Some families took in neighbors, while their hearths were gutted. Others turned to her for design sketches only, too proud to admit they needed her hands. But they needed her, desperately, because the cold didn't let up. It got worse. By the end of January, a snowstorm buried the valley in drifts higher than a wagon wheel. Roads disappeared, smoke vanished into the whiteness, the sky went grey for days, and the cold took on a soundless pressure, the kind that made windows crack and breath freeze to your scarf in one exhale. During that storm, 2 children nearly froze to death in their sleep. Only the fact that their father had started digging a radiant hearth saved them. He moved them to sleep on the stones in progress, still warm from a fire laid hours before. That stone, built using Mary's exact design, radiated heat long enough to hold off the worst. After that, no one questioned her again. There were whispers now, but not mocking ones, stories. She figured it all out from a mill her brother saw back east. No, her father was some kind of engineer. I heard she saw a temple in China, where the floors were always warm. Some even said she wasn't American, that she was from somewhere older, where winters were crueler and wood scarcer. One man said her people must have lived underground. Another insisted she was part Cherokee, or Icelandic, or Roman. No one could believe someone from here could have built something like that on her own. They needed her to be foreign, because if she wasn't, then what did that say about them? Mary didn't care. She didn't ask for thanks. She didn't ask for stories to be corrected. She just kept drawing, kept helping. She taught a boy of 12 how to mix the clay right. She taught an old trapper how to seal his seams with ash instead of wasting pitch. She even built a half-scale model outside her own cabin, just so folks could see how the airflow worked. One old-timer wept when he realized how little wood it used, said he could have kept his wife alive last winter if he'd known. Mary didn't say a word. She simply handed him the shovel. There was only one man who refused, Ethan Graves, a big man with a bitter streak and a chimney tall as pride. He said Mary's design was fine for women and weaklings, but he preferred the real heat of a proper fire. Said you couldn't feel warmth unless it licked your boots and smoked your lungs. He chopped 4 cords in fall and boasted he'd need no woman's tricks to survive a few flakes. By mid-February, his cabin was the coldest in the valley. His logs burned fast, his flue leaked, and when the ice storm hit on the 15th, the weight of the snow cracked his chimney clean through. The capstan fell through the roof, dragging slush and soot with it. His stove was buried. His children, both under 10, were blue-lipped and coughing by morning. Mary didn't wait for him to knock. She hitched her mule and hauled 2 hot bricks to his cabin herself, wrapped them in wool, and placed them under the children's bed. Ethan didn't speak, not that day, not for 3 more. But by the end of the week, he was at her cabin with his sleeves rolled and his head lowered. "I need your help." Mary only nodded. The freeze lasted into March, longer than any winter in memory, the kind they said only came once in a generation. But that year, no one died of cold. Not a single person in the valley lost a child to frost, or a toe to black rot, or a finger to frozen tools, because Mary Haskell had bricked up her fireplace and taught the others how to seal theirs too. When the thaw finally came, the first thing they did, before even digging out the wagons or clearing the roads, was gather at her cabin, not to mock, to honor. Some brought sketches, others brought food. One brought a stone tablet, hand-chiseled, showing a hearth with a sealed chimney and the words, "One handful of wood, days of warmth." They asked if she'd teach it to the next town downriver. She agreed, but she never left the valley, because something strange had happened in all those weeks, something more unexpected than the storm or the radiant hearth, or the men who'd once laughed now asking to learn. The valley had changed, and so had Mary. Spring came late that year, like a child afraid to step into a room where too many had suffered in silence. The snow melted slow, cautious, and left behind a terrain so waterlogged and sun-starved it made the valley look like a graveyard with puddles. Dead limbs littered the trails. Wagons rotted where they'd been left frozen in January. Chimneys leaned, cracked, and sagged like defeated men. But Mary's cabin stood unchanged. Its bricks held firm. The ground around it was dry. The door swung smooth on its hinges, and not a single window pane had shattered from the deep cold. If anything, it looked cleaner. The snow had melted evenly, like the warmth from below had dried the earth with quiet efficiency. And the people noticed, because now they weren't just recovering from a storm, they were remembering what had been proven during it. That warmth didn't have to roar, that fire didn't have to blaze. That survival didn't depend on chopping until your arms went numb and stacking logs like a prison wall. It depended on knowing what to keep and what to lose. And that old, smoke-belching, heat-leaking way of life, that could be lost. Mary didn't change overnight. She still wore her coats too long and her sleeves too short. She still came to town with that same rope-handled basket and always paid in coin. But now, When she walked into a store, people greeted her with nods, not just politeness, but a respect that felt earned. No more mockery in their eyes, no more smirks when she walked past, and the men who'd once laughed now talked about thermal mass and airflow ratios like they'd grown up beside a boiler works. Some even started sketching their own versions of the hearth design, tweaking the dimensions or testing new bricks. One man tried to incorporate old wagon wheels as radiant panels. Another started collecting broken iron stovetops to weld into heat plates. A quiet revolution was happening, built not on noise but on understanding, and it started beneath a floor where once there had only been cold stone. By mid-April, travelers returned. Snowmelt opened the roads. Traders came up from the river to find a changed valley. Not in appearance, but in attitude. A sense of preparedness hung in the air. No one was desperate. No one bartered in panic. Everyone seemed to have survived the longest winter in memory with confidence. "What did y'all do up here?" one wagon driver asked. "I saw towns downriver looking like they'd been hit by war." The answer came from a boy, no older than 11, who was squatting outside with a piece of chalk, drawing out a heating diagram in the dirt. "We changed our floors," he said without looking up. The driver didn't understand, but the others nodded. That was enough. Late in May, a letter came. It was sealed in brown wax and carried by a man in a wool coat too fine for frontier dust. He asked for Mary Haskell by name and waited near her cabin until she came home from the creek. The others watched, wary, protective now, in ways they hadn't been before. The man introduced himself as an engineer from Omaha, said he represented a firm that had heard things about a method of home heating used somewhere in the mountains, a method too efficient to be believed. He had sketches, notes, even an offer of payment. Mary listened quietly, then she invited him inside. She showed him everything: the hearth, the bricks, the iron chamber, the sealed chimney, the airflow gate. And then, as the man scribbled with inked fingers and eyes full of capital, she asked just one question. "What do you plan to do with this?" He said he wanted to patent it, improve it, scale it up, sell it. "And if it costs too much for folks who need it most?" she asked. He smiled, the kind of smile Mary had seen before, behind desks, inside city halls, in the backs of train cars headed west. "That's just the nature of progress, Mom." She didn't raise her voice, didn't curse or throw him out. She simply led him to the door, handed him his notes, and said one word: "No." He left confused, angry maybe, muttering about wasted time. But Mary didn't care, because the thing she'd built wasn't meant for cities and factories and men who measured worth in coin weight. It was meant for cold nights, for calloused hands, for widows with no one to chop their wood, and children with lungs too soft for smoke. It was meant for here. Summer came, soft and sudden. The fields greened, the cabins dried. And the strange thing was, folks didn't go back to the old ways. Even with the sun out and the risk of freeze months away, they kept improving the radiant hearths. Some added vents, others built stone benches over the floor slabs, where the warmth could be felt hours after a fire died. It wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about belonging to something smarter than before. There was a town meeting in July, a rare thing. Usually the valley was too scattered for formal gatherings, but that summer they called one in the old Grange Hall, which still leaned slightly from a storm 5 years back. Families came in wagons, on mules, on foot. Children climbed the rafters while men and women fanned themselves in the heat. And Mary was called forward, not to be thanked, not exactly, but to be asked. They wanted to name the design, to give it a title. "The Haskell Hearth," someone proposed. She shook her head. "Call it what it is," she said. "A fire you don't waste." That winter the frost came late, and when it did, it came gentle. But the cabins were ready. Every home had some version of Mary's radiant design. Some still had chimneys, now sealed off. Some had replaced their floors entirely with fitted brick slabs. And all of them, from the eldest trapper's shack to the newest family's half-finished cabin, had heat that stayed. Children played barefoot in December. Women no longer feared childbirth in frozen air. Men spent less time chopping and more time being, with their families, with their neighbors, with the life they'd nearly lost to firewood and pride. And Mary, she was still there, still walking the same trail to the creek, still rolling her sleeves, still drawing in the margins of old papers at night by lantern light. Not because she wanted to prove anything, but because she knew something the world kept forgetting. Fire is loud, but warmth, true warmth, that's quiet. By the time the second winter rolled around, something had shifted, not just in the buildings, but in the bones of the valley itself. The people had changed, the way they thought, the way they prepared, the way they spoke about warmth. It was no longer about fire. It was about keeping what you made, holding on to it, making it last. And at the center of all of it was Mary. She still didn't seek the attention. She still didn't act like someone with power. But when the first winds started howling across the peaks that November, families sent their boys down from the ridge to ask if she'd come check their floor designs. Some invited her to supper, quietly hoping she'd spot a mistake. A few just left sketches and notes outside her cabin door, like offerings at a shrine, praying she'd mark them up and leave them back on the stoop by morning. She did. She corrected dimensions. She rewrote airflow routes. She returned diagrams with soot marks on the corners and little pencil arrows that saved families weeks of labor. But more than anything, she shared. The knowledge was no longer hers alone. It had become theirs. That winter didn't hit as hard, not in temperature anyway. But it came with its own danger, overconfidence. Some newer arrivals, folks who hadn't been through the freeze the year before, took shortcuts. One man tried building a radiant hearth using loose river stones instead of dense brick. Another used sheet tin instead of iron. A family from Kansas ignored Mary's guidance and bricked their hearth flush with the wooden floor. 3 cabins caught fire. One nearly collapsed from heat damage. That's when Mary made a decision she'd never made before. She started teaching formally. It wasn't a school, not at first. Just a ring of stones behind her cabin and a flat board where she'd lay out her tools. But word got out. By the second week of December, a dozen people were showing up each morning, notebook and pencil in hand, stomping snow off their boots to sit and learn how to trap warmth like water in a barrel. She spoke little. She showed how to mix mortar with ash to improve insulation, how to angle airflow so it curled under the slab instead of escaping, how to time a burn so the stones held heat from dusk till dawn. She used analogies, not math. You're not building a fire, you're building a memory of one, and it stuck, because they understood her now, not just her design, but her way of seeing the world. Quiet, lasting, intentional. A traveler from the north came through that January, some kind of newspaper man from St. Paul, or so he claimed, said he'd heard stories of a widow in the mountain passes who heats her home with barely a flame. He asked questions, took notes, asked to take a picture, which she refused. He offered money. She declined. He asked why she didn't sell the design, patent it, spread it, get rich. Mary said nothing for a while, just looked past him toward the mountains. Then finally, because if they think it costs something, they won't share it. February brought bitter winds again, but this time no one panicked. Instead of hauling endless cords, families tended small stacks of twigs and bark. Children learned how to prep a stove for radiant burn. Old men, who'd once scoffed at newfangled nonsense, now taught younger settlers how to seal air gaps around a slab using just clay and cloth. One of the men, a grizzled trapper named Lucius, who'd lost 2 fingers to frostbite a decade ago, even wrote a small book, hand-copied, titled Heat That Stays. It was passed from family to family until a trader heading west asked if he could buy a copy. Lucius refused to take money. He gave it to the man for free. "Just don't keep it to yourself," he said. That's the one rule. It wasn't just warmth anymore. It was trust. When a new family moved in, a young couple with a baby and barely a wagon to their name, the valley didn't just sell them firewood. They rebuilt their hearth, showed them how to save what little wood they had, gave them a brick slab from the stockpile Mary had helped cure in summer. The child didn't cry once that winter. And when the father, eyes still full of disbelief, asked how they could repay the kindness, the answer was simple: teach the next ones. But not everyone was satisfied with keeping it quiet. That March, as the snow began to loosen its grip, 2 men arrived from Denver. One was a government surveyor. The other claimed to be from a company specializing in efficient living solutions. They wanted to talk to Mary. She agreed. Warily, they asked to see her system. She obliged. They asked for measurements. She provided them. They asked if she'd be willing to franchise it. She said no. The company man, slick and sure of himself, chuckled. "Ma'am, this kind of thing? It's bigger than your valley." Mary stood in her doorway, calm, still, firelight behind her, casting her in silhouette. "It doesn't need to be bigger," she said. "It just needs to work." The man looked annoyed. "This could change everything." Mary nodded. "It already has." They didn't understand. They never would, because to them, warmth was a commodity, a thing you sold, packaged, owned. But to the people in the valley, it had become something else entirely, a language. You could tell how someone burned their wood by how they laid their stones. You could read a person's intentions in how well they sealed their seams. Children whispered secrets while warming their feet on brick slabs, and couples held hands in silence, listening to the quiet hum of heat rising from beneath their floor. Fire had once been noise, desperation, survival. Now it was memory, design, a kind of grace that didn't need to shout to be felt. One night near the end of winter, Dobbs, the same man who'd once barged into her cabin full of doubt, sat with Mary on her porch. They didn't talk for a long time, just watched the snow fall in soft flakes that didn't stick. Finally he spoke. "You ever think about leaving here?" She shook her head. "This place was cold once," she said. "Now it isn't. Why would I leave?" He nodded. "Fair, then. You ever regret bricking up that fireplace?" Mary looked at the spot where it had once gaped like a wound in the wall. "No," she said. "I regret how long it took me to know I could." When the third winter came, no one chopped wood in desperation. There were no panicked axe swings, no sun-up to sundown stacking of logs, as if life itself depended on brute piles. Instead, men walked slowly to their sheds, measured what they had, and calmly collected what would be enough. Because now, they knew exactly how much that was. It had become routine. One bundle of twigs, one fire, 3 days of heat. Mary still lived in the same cabin, same slab floor, same bricked-up hearth. But the world around her had changed in quiet, extraordinary ways. The children no longer knew what it meant to shiver in bed. The elderly didn't fall ill with every shift in temperature, and women, especially the ones who lived alone, no longer feared the long months of dark and snow. They had a floor that remembered the fire, and they had her to thank for it. But Mary didn't see it that way. To her, it was just survival, just sense, a lesson learned from hardship and heat loss, passed on because no one else had thought to try. She never claimed invention, never asked for credit. She always said the same thing when asked. "Warmth doesn't need to be loud, it needs to stay." That year, a new widow came to the valley. Her name was Honora Mott, 31, 2 children, husband lost to a logging accident in Bitter Creek. She arrived in a broken-wheeled wagon with a small pig, a stove that didn't draft right, and eyes so hollow they looked like she hadn't slept since fall. She was given a plot at the far end of the ridge, near the tree break, a cold corner. No one had lived there long, too exposed to wind, too far from the main trail, but the earth was dry, and the southern face got morning light. Mary visited her the second day. Didn't bring food, didn't bring pity. She brought bricks. They worked side by side for a week. Mary guided, Honora learned. The children carried sand in buckets and helped press mortar into the seams. They laid stone in the shallow pit beneath what would become the hearth. Mary showed Honora how to insulate beneath with dry ash and split clay, how to build the chamber so it didn't roar but held. "It's not fire you're building," she said. "It's memory of fire." Honora didn't speak for a long while. Then finally, Orma with cracked lips. "It feels like something I can control," Mary nodded. "That's what saved me too." By mid-January, the Mott cabin was the warmest on the ridge, and not because it burned the hottest, because it kept what it was given. Neighbors visited. Children played on the slab floor, laying with their cheeks pressed to the stone and laughing at how warm it was. Honora began sketching her own diagrams. She asked Mary if she could teach it forward. Mary smiled for the first time in days. "That's all I ask." In the 4th spring, the Denver men returned. This time they brought lawyers. They'd heard stories of whole valleys heating homes on a design with no chimney, no patent, and no price tag. They argued that if Mary didn't protect her idea, someone else would, that the warmth she'd built would be stolen, marketed, and profited on by men who had never known the bite of mountain frost or the silence of an empty firebox in January. Mary listened. Then she walked outside, knelt beside the slab hearth that had been her first, and pulled free one brick. She handed it to the man in the grey coat. "You want it?" she said. "Here, take it. But understand something." She looked at him hard, clear, steady. "What makes this work ain't in the brick. It's in how you treat people with it." They didn't come back, because they knew what she meant. If you sold the heat, you broke it. If you put a price on the method, it stopped spreading, because it only worked in the hands of those who needed it and shared it, those who burned less and lived more. Mary was older now, not old, but the kind of older you become after 5 long winters and countless cabins warmed by your hands. She had calluses she never used to, grey hairs near her temples, a quiet strength that made men step aside without being told. And when people looked back at that stretch of years, from the storm that froze every cabin but hers, to the spring when warmth became common sense, they didn't remember the bricks first. They remembered the woman who had bricked up her fireplace and refused to explain it until the world was quiet enough to listen. One last thing. Years later, a scholar came through, a young man from the university in Helena, writing about frontier innovations. He'd heard of the Haskell hearth and came hoping for documents, blueprints, some original patent. Mary had none of that. She gave him a cup of tea and a story. "So, how did you know it would work?" he asked. She sipped once, staring into the steam. "I didn't," she said. "I just knew the old way didn't." When he asked if he could write about her, she said yes. But she asked for one favor. "Don't make it sound like I was special. Make it sound like anyone could have done it. Because the truth is, they still can." He promised, and he kept it. Some years later, when that story was finally published, the Valley children had grown. Many had moved west, some to new towns, some to cities. And wherever they went, they brought something with them. Not money, not fame. They brought warmth, quiet, lasting, built from fire remembered, not fire wasted. In towns and cabins far beyond Jacob's Pass, There are floors that hold heat 3 days from a single handful of wood, homes with no chimneys, stoves that don't roar, spaces that feel like someone thought of you before you walked inside. All because one widow didn't explain herself. She just bricked up her fireplace and waited for the world to feel the cold.